What's up, JFA? I'm excited to recap with you this week in our centered reading. We were in Matthew chapters 23 through 27, and man, this is just a packed section of scripture. You know, you start out in what we know as the Passion Week, and Jesus is in the last week of his earthly ministry and his life, and he crams a lot of ministry into this last week. He tells the Pharisees that they need to wash their life because they're being hypocrites. And so he warns them. And then he tells the disciples to be vigilant because he's going to come back and they need to wash their life closely. And then we see how he leads them into a time where he institutes communion in the Lord's Supper. And then we see his arrest and his trial and ultimately his crucifixion and his death. And so there's a lot happening in these verses, but there's one thing that I really want to just zone in with you as we recap this last week. And that thought is this: what is Jesus worth to you? Perhaps the most shocking aspect of this scripture is that one of his closest disciples, one of his 12 apostles, actually is the one that betrays him, Judas Iscariot. And it says in Matthew 26, starting verse 14, it says, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I will deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And at that moment, he saw an opportunity to betray him." When you read that, it's just shocking. Judas is there and he says, "What can I get for betraying Jesus?" And he agrees to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now, how much is 30 pieces of silver, you might ask? Well, coincidentally enough, according to Exodus chapter 21, that is the price that you paid when one of your oxen gored a slave of another person. So in short, Jesus was worth no more than a slave to Judas. And that's so sad because Jesus was there to completely save and redeem the world. And yet for Judas, he completely overlooked that. If you flip over to the next chapter, in chapter 27, Judas actually has a lot of guilt when he sees that Jesus is arrested, and he goes and he tries to give the money back. He's trying to fix it, and the chief priests won't have anything to do with it. And so they ultimately say, "Look, the decision you made is on your own head." And Judas throws the money down and he runs out of there, and he ultimately goes and he commits suicide. It's just a tragedy all the way around. So what is it that we can learn from this? Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can learn. When Jesus is of no value to you, there's going to be some bad consequences and some negative repercussions in our own spiritual life. And the first one is this: when Jesus is of no value to you, ultimately you're going to sell him out when he doesn't give you what you want. You know, a lot of Christians are following Jesus and they're trying to go to church and they're trying to read their Bible and they're trying to obey God simply because they believe when they do the right things, when they check the right boxes, that God is ultimately going to give them what they want. And as soon as life gets tough or the world starts crashing down around them, they sell Jesus out. They give up on their faith. They run out on him, and they ultimately betray him with their life. And that's no good for any of us. And probably we're all a little bit guilty of that. But we need to watch this just a little bit. You see, Judas was following Jesus, a lot of scholars believe, because he thought Jesus was going to lead a rebellion against the Romans. And as soon as it was evident that that was not Jesus' plans, Jesus is telling them over and over again. In fact, he tells them 3 times, "I'm going to go to a cross and I'm going to die for the sins of the world." When Judas hears this, that's not what he wanted to be a part of. That is, quote, not what he signed up for. And so he ultimately betrayed Jesus. Why are we following Jesus? Are we following Jesus for what we get or because of who he is? Judas, when he forgot who Jesus was, he was willing to sell him out. And unfortunately, we do the same things. You know, the problem is that when we have such a low value of Jesus, we ultimately have a lot of shame and guilt associated with that. You know, Judas, when he realized that he cost Jesus his life, he has a lot of guilt and he has a lot of shame. And so he goes and he tries to fix it. But by that point, it's too late. And so many of us from time to time, we were following Jesus for the wrong reasons. And as soon as we realized that, instead of running to Christ, we ran away from him. And that's exactly what Judas did. You know, Judas wasn't alone in his betrayal of Jesus. In fact, every single apostle ran out on Jesus before it was over. You know, Jesus even told them, you're all going to run away. You know, the shepherd's going to be struck and the sheep are going to scatter. And that's exactly what happened the night that Jesus was arrested. Everybody scattered and ran from him. And Jesus restored all the other 11. And what that tells us is Jesus would have restored Judas as well. He would have forgiven Judas if Judas was repentant. But instead of running to Christ, Judas ran away. And I want to encourage you, maybe you're in a season where Jesus was of little value to you, and now you realize that was a mistake. Don't run from Jesus. Instead, run to him, draw near to him. Just as he restored Peter when Peter denied him, so too he'll restore you, and he will take that guilt and that shame from you, and he'll give you adoption and as a son or a daughter to the Father. Ultimately, this section of scripture is just so powerful, and there's 100 different ways we could have went with it, and there's 100 different things we could have looked at. But I just want to challenge you with this. What value does Christ have in your life? If you were to be honest, you were to step away and you were to look at your life, what would be the evidence that you love him, that you follow him? And maybe you are in a season right now where you're just using Jesus. Correct that behavior. Start drawing near to him in a relationship through reading your word, through prayer, through worship. Draw near to Christ, because when you do that, there's ultimately going to become this fellowship with him that is going to just be life-giving to you. You know, Jesus had a plan for Judas. He had a plan of salvation. He had a purpose for him to help be one of the founding apostles to take the gospel into the whole world, and yet Judas sabotaged all that. God has a plan for you too, so don't allow a low value of Christ in your life to sabotage God's purpose for you. Draw near to him, love him, have fellowship with him, and watch God do amazing things in your life. It'll be a benefit to you. Hey, don't give up on the centered reading. Keep going. If you're a little bit behind, you can catch up, or you can just pick up where we're at. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Sunday.